I stared at my computer screen in disbelief as the loading wheel spun. Endlessly, the video call had frozen. Mid-sentence, my potential employer's face pixelated into an unrecognizable blur. This was it, my chance to finally land a decent job after being laid off 6 months ago, and my internet had just died. At the worst possible moment, the silence in my home office felt deafening as I frantically clicked refresh, knowing it was already too late. Another opportunity lost to Karen Miller and her petty vendetta against renters like me. Let me back up a few weeks after the layoff. I had to make some tough choices. The executive lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to was no longer sustainable, so I downsized significantly. I found a modest rental home in Willowbrook Estates, a cookie-cutter suburban development with manicured lawns and strict HOA rules. The rent was reasonable, and most importantly, for my job search, it came with access to high-speed fiber internet through the community's bulk service contract. What I didn't anticipate was Karen Miller at 52. She was the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates, serving as HOA president for the past 8 years. Karen had perfectly styled blonde hair, designer athleisure wear, and the kind of entitled attitude that could curdle milk. She made it crystal clear from day one that renters were second-class citizens in her domain. During my first community meeting, she looked me up and down with obvious disdain and said with a saccharine smile, "We'll see how long you last here. Renters usually don't appreciate the standards we maintain." The problems started almost immediately. My internet would randomly cut out during important video calls, forcing me to use my phone's hotspot and burning through my data plan. At first, I assumed it was typical service hiccups. These things happen, right? But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time I had a scheduled interview or client presentation, my connection would mysteriously fail. Meanwhile, my homeowner neighbors bragged about their lightning-fast speeds and rock-solid reliability. I spent hours on the phone with the internet service provider, explaining the situation over and over. The customer service representatives were sympathetic but kept insisting that all residents in Willowbrook Estates receive the same premium service. They ran diagnostics, sent technicians, and even replaced my modem twice. Nothing worked. The outages continued with surgical precision, always at the most inconvenient moments possible. Finally, I demanded to speak with a supervisor who had access to more detailed account information, which she revealed made my blood boil. My service had been deliberately downgraded to the lowest tier available, throttled to barely functional speeds during peak hours. The supervisor seemed confused because, according to their records, the change had been authorized through the HOA's master account, an account controlled exclusively by Karen Miller as the community's designated representative. That's when everything clicked into place. Karen wasn't just being passively hostile, she was actively sabotaging my internet service because she believed renters didn't deserve the same quality of life as homeowners. Her exact words during one heated confrontation were burned into my memory. High-speed internet is a privilege for people who actually invest in this community, not temporary residents who contribute nothing. I realized I needed to approach this systematically. 20 years in, corporate management had taught me the value of thorough documentation and strategic thinking. I started keeping detailed logs of every outage, every slow connection, every mysterious service interruption. I also began reaching out to other renters in the community, and what I discovered was staggering. Karen had been systematically targeting rental properties for months, downgrading their internet service while collecting additional fees from the service provider for account management services. This wasn't just petty HOA tyranny anymore. This was fraud. Karen had been manipulating the bulk internet contract to funnel money into HOA accounts while denying equal service to paying Residents she was charging the internet company for premium service to all units, while secretly downgrading renters and pocketing the difference. Even worse, she was interfering with communications infrastructure which violated federal regulations. I spent 2 weeks building an airtight case. I obtained copies of the original bulk service contract. Through a public records request, I documented the discrepancies between promised and delivered service levels. I gathered testimony from 5 other rental residents who had experienced identical problems. Most damaging of all, I managed to obtain screenshots of Karen's email exchanges with the service provider where she explicitly requested that temporary residents receive basic service only despite the community contract guaranteeing premium access to all units. With my evidence compiled, I contacted the Federal Communications Commission and filed a formal complaint about unauthorized interference with communication services. I also reached out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division since Karen's scheme involved wire fraud across state lines. The internet service provider was headquartered in another state. The federal agents were surprisingly interested in my case. Apparently, HOA-related fraud had become a growing problem and they were looking for clear-cut examples to prosecute. They opened a formal investigation and asked me to continue documenting Karen's activities while they gathered additional evidence. For 3 weeks, I played the role of unwitting victim. HOA federal investigators quietly built their case. Karen, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to the storm gathering around her. She continued her reign of terror with obvious glee, bragging to other homeowners about how she was maintaining community standards by making life difficult for renters. During one particularly memorable HOA meeting, she announced with obvious pride that rental properties would be subject to additional service limitations to encourage more permanent residency solutions. The end came swiftly and dramatically. On a Tuesday morning at 7:30 a.m., I was drinking coffee and checking emails when I heard commotion outside. Through my window, I watched 2 black subversives pull up to Karen's pristine colonial home across the street. Federal agents in navy blue windbreakers emerged and walked purposefully toward her front door. Karen answered in her silk bathrobe, clearly expecting to sign for a package or dismiss some unwelcome solicitor. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Agent Jennifer Rodriguez, who presented a federal warrant for her arrest on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and unauthorized interference with communications infrastructure. The neighborhood gathered like moths to a flame as Karen was read her rights in her own driveway. Her face cycled through confusion, indignation, and finally, genuine terror as the reality of her situation sank in. This is ridiculous, she shrieked as the handcuffs clicked into place. I was protecting property values. These renters don't belong here anyway. Agent Rodriguez's response was matter of fact and devastating. Ma'am, you're under arrest for systematically defrauding both residents and service providers while violating federal communications laws. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. As they loaded Karen into the back of the federal vehicle, I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. The woman who had spent months making my life miserable because she believed renters were somehow less deserving was now facing serious federal charges that would follow her for the rest of her life. The investigation revealed the full scope of Karen's operation. She had been running this scheme for over 2 years, systematically targeting every rental property in Willowbrook Estates. The FBI discovered that she had created fake invoices, forged service authorization documents, and even established a shell company called Community Standards Management to launder the stolen funds. Her garage was filled with boxes of financial documents that showed meticulous record-keeping of her Fraudulent activities, what made Karen's case even worse was her complete lack of remorse. During questioning, she repeatedly insisted that she was justified in her actions because renters were temporary residents who didn't deserve premium services. Agent Rodriguez later told me that Karen had actually tried to argue that she was performing a public service by maintaining property values through service discrimination. The federal prosecutor didn't mess around. Karen was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, each carrying up to 20 years in prison and fines of up to $250,000. The conspiracy charges added another potential 5 years. Additional charges for money laundering through her shell company brought the potential sentence to over 50 years total. During her arraignment, she learned that her scheme had defrauded residents and service providers of over $40,000, pushing her case into felony territory with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. But the humiliation didn't stop there. Karen's arrest made the local news, and her mug shot became an internet sensation when someone posted it with a caption, Karen finally gets what she deserves. Her employer, a prestigious real estate firm, immediately terminated her position and issued a public statement distancing themselves from her actions. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her from all positions effective immediately. The most devastating blow came when the judge denied her bail application, citing her as a flight risk due to the severity of the charges and her history of manipulating financial systems. Karen broke down sobbing in the courtroom when she realized she would remain in federal custody until trial. Her perfectly coy hair was disheveled, her designer clothes replaced with an orange jumpsuit, and her imperious attitude reduced to desperate pleading. Karen's face went completely white when the judge read the potential penalties. She had gone from small-town HOA dictator to federal defendant, facing decades in prison and financial ruin. Her perfectly controlled world had collapsed in a matter of hours, and there was no HOA rulebook that could save her.